very frequently, for instance, we get frustrated with people who have different political ideas or different views of how the economy should be run. And I have here some, let's say, distinct levels in which interpersonal disagreement occurs. This is, for instance, in the family, in the neighborhood, in society, in the national level, and in the international level. These are all different dimensions or different contexts within which different disagreements arise. So, for instance, naming disputes are not going to be resolved in the family level. Naming disputes between countries.
Oh, right, I see.
This is more of an international affair. But it could also be a national affair if you have people from within a nation who disagree about it. And of course, you could have people within the family who disagree about it. But the thing is that very frequently people think that disagreement is something completely corrosive. For instance, they say that, when you have disagreements in the family, this means that these families are about to disintegrate. When you have disagreement in societies, that's a bad sign. When you have disagreements in the international level, that's, let's say, the path to war. So what is it about disagreement that people find so frustrating from a psychological perspective? Why is it so bad, or why people feel that it is so bad if someone doesn't view things the way they do?
Well, I think there's a physiological element of disagreement being a prerequisite for violence. And that's uncomfortable, obviously. No one really wants there to be a sudden eruption of violence, and it can come to that. And I think this underpins all verbal disagreements, is that things could escalate and get heated to that point. I think that's more pertinent to men in particular than women. If two women are disagreeing, normally it doesn't have that same level of undercurrent. It's still there to a very small extent, but not nearly to the same extent. But it also depends on how disagreeable you are as a disposition, how comfortable you are with disagreeing. You could look at, say, the 19th century, and there was the rule of never talk about politics or religion. And it seems to me that that's a bit naive, because then you're going to be stunted in those two areas because you've not fleshed out your ideas enough. You've not been challenged, and that's how they grow, really. And so I think people wanted to be liked. People want to be polite to other people. They want to feel like they're a good person. But to be a good person, I think you've got to kind of trim off the fat of what you believe and get rid of things that don't necessarily make sense. And so through disagreement, it's like a workout for your brain, if I'm being really basic about it. Not only is it good for you in a sort of metacognitive sense, you start thinking about how you think more, but also the ideas you actually have are going to be more realistic, supposedly, at least if you refine them over having lots of disagreements. If you just come across one person who disagrees with you and then you change your mind, well, they could be wrong as well. So there's a sort of process going on here.
Okay, I think that this is something that can be viewed from a different perspective. Mm-hmm. Because, yes, I agree with you that when, for instance, people disagree, things could escalate to violence. But we could view things the other way. We could say that, to paraphrase a known quote, the first person who swore, who cursed, instead of throwing a rock, was the founder of civilization. So you could say something like that.
Well, words are still always a better alternative to violence if yes, the option is available, because you're in control of how much words hurt you, whereas physical pain, hurts no matter what, unless you're, a retreatist Buddhist monk, and then you can get kicked in the nuts and not feel it, supposedly. That was a bit left of field. But I think that there's an understanding that because disagreement only affects someone as much as you allow it to, that it's a less severe, less confrontational form of resolving things.
Right. So I think that the main question to be asked here is whether we can coexist while we disagree.
Well, I've thought about this a lot actually, because of course you have the situation in the United States where the country's basically split, if the polling is to be believed. And so how can you have a nation of people that are divided into two tribal lines? And I think that the only way you could resolve that situation is if people agreed on the rules of the game. And although I don't see that happening in the United States' case anytime soon, I think that this happens more often in sort of everyday life, and also in other countries more so. I think there are things about the United States where there are lots of emphasis placed on, well, this is what I believe, this is what I as an individual believe. And although I think that's actually the right way to go about it, that people are not afraid to speak their mind, it also means that there are more disagreements.
Yeah.
But I think that's good, not necessarily a bad thing. I think actually suppressing things and not addressing them is far more unhealthy, even if there's more explicit tension in the air, if you will. It's still better than everything sort of simmering behind the surface, and then maybe like a sort of volcanic eruption, you've got no indication that it's happening, and then this massive destruction kind of emanates out of nowhere. So it's better to release these things, I think. But I think what I've distracted myself talking about US politics. The question was about...
No, I don't think that it was a distraction or a tangent, because the question is, how can we agree, how can we coexist despite
I remember what I was going to say,
disagreements?
So I think it's easier to talk about this at an interpersonal level, because I think most people have experienced what I'm about to talk about. And that is simply that two people can disagree and be very civil about it, and actually both go away feeling positive about that interaction, even though, you know, if you're being perfectly objective, it wasn't necessarily a positive one. It's one where, you know, you're not agreeing on something. There's potential for conflict, there's potential for factionalism. But if you treat each other in a way in which you allow the other person, as well as yourself, to maintain their self-respect. And I actually spoke to you about this earlier, and it's the notion of in say an ancient battle, you allow the enemy a possibility to retreat. You don't wall them in and close them off and force them to fight. You gracefully allow them to give up. And not only is this a good way of winning arguments more generally, it's also good manners, and it's also a good way for people not to feel as intimidated.
Right, so the challenge is to get people together to agree with respect to the rules of the game. But you will have people who will constantly disagree with them.
Yes, of course.
So
and that is just the human condition, isn't it? But
yeah,
I think that the way... I was just going to say that human beings are sort of coalitional in a sense. They form social coalitions with like-minded people who more or less agree on the rules of the game. And at certain points in history, these coalitions have been bigger than others. Sometimes there's a reasonable amount of overlap and people can mostly civilly agree, but then there are a few sticking points. There's a whole sort of spectrum. But the general thing is that there's a sort of monoculture there, in the sense that where I grew up, everyone behaved in a very similar and well-mannered and polite way. And so there was very little in the way of disagreement. I think there was never a time where, you know, I had a negative interaction with the people I lived around, because everyone understood. You know, they didn't have to explicitly be told, but they implicitly knew that, yes, these are the things you do to be a member of this community, so you aren't annoying to other people, and you respect, you know, the wishes of other people. And as long as you adhere to these, other people would adhere to them in return, and therefore you both benefit. And there is, there's a certain amount of self-interest in forming this. It's treating others as you wish to be treated. And I think there's an element of self-interest there, because it's suggesting that you treat others nicely because they treat you nicely in return, rather than it being, purely altruistic. Although, I think that all altruism has to be related to some degree of self-interest, in a sense, even if you're interested in just the well-being of the other person.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.